This is The Psychoanalysis and the Life of Ted Bundy by Ryan Bogus, Psychology 484, A.801. A biography of Theodore Robert Bundy. Ted Bundy was born November 24th, 1946 to Eleanor Cowell and an unknown father. Bundy would eventually find out who his father was, but he never met him. Ted Bundy was born illegitimately to Eleanor and spent a majority of his adolescent life thinking she was his sister. So when he was old enough to understand relationships, Ted was told his mother was his sister and that his grandparents were his actual parents. He reported to have known all along that this was a hoax, but it was never actually proven that that was true or not. When Ted was only a few years old, his mother moved him and her to Tacoma, Washington, where she married Johnny Bundy. Eleanor and Johnny had a few kids together, and that was the name that Ted Bundy took on, was Johnny's last name. Ted's grandfather was the one person that Ted claimed to have related to the most, which is concerning since his grandfather was known to have a huge temper, abusive tendencies, and somewhat of a pornographic hobby. Ted never liked Johnny Bundy much. He thought lowly of him somewhat, since he was just a line cook. Without knowing it, Bundy seemed to have a superiority complex at a young age that somehow he was already better than Johnny in some way. From an early age, Ted liked to steal things. He performed well in school, but poorly with his peers. So Ted was known to have stolen things his whole life. It was just something that he did. He was never named a kleptomaniac, but it is likely, with all the other acute mental illnesses he had, that he probably was a kleptomaniac as well. Ted excelled in school, was popular, but never really thought of himself in that way, and he kept mostly to himself. And all this information was contained in his documentary by Seligson in 1995. And that is a picture of his mom and Tacoma. Biography of Ted Bundy continued. While excelling in school, Bundy attended the University of Washington for undergraduate, where he met the love of his life, reportedly, Stephanie Brooks. Stephanie was older than Ted, but exhibited traits that Ted Bundy never had in his life. She had a tight-knit family life, came from wealth, and was extremely attractive, at least to Bundy. She had long brown hair parted in the middle, which is important because it was suspected that Bundy modeled his victims after Stephanie, possibly as a way to get back at her, or also maybe to exert some type of control over her. Stephanie broke up with him, and Bundy reportedly never got over it, even while he was in another serious relationship with a woman he eventually married. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later. Bundy also had an undergraduate degree in psychology, making him relatable to his victims. Bundy would oftentimes act as though he was in trouble to get girls to go with him. Sometimes Bundy would put his arm in a sling when he had no need for one. His arm was fine, and he'd ask a girl to help him get to his car. One time he went so far as to ask a girl if she would get in his car with him and go get her sailboat with her. This girl refused, but later that day, another woman went missing when he asked her to get his sailboat with him, reportedly. That was never found to be true or not, but that can also be found in a book by Rule in 1980. In addition to this, Bundy was an overly engaging person, making people feel safe when around him, or that he was in some way trustworthy. This contributes to his possible narcissism that was reported over his lifetime. This will be discussed further, but at this point, all that can be said is that Bundy would get these women to trust him and make them feel safe around him, and then he would take advantage of that by capitalizing on taking control over them. And then in addition to that, for those of you that don't know, Ted Bundy kidnapped, raped, murdered, sodomized, and committed necrophilia on his victims. Not all of those were committed on each of his victims, but all of those were committed to some degree during his lifetime. Psychoanalysis proposed by Freud, and there's Freud. So, first proposed in his dual instinct theory in 1920, Freud suggested that there are two basic elements to human behavior: the life instinct, which is also known as eros, and the death instinct, which is known as thanatos, I believe it's pronounced, cited in Cray 2013. Basically, this theory states that eros drives people towards pleasure-seeking stimuli and fulfillment, while Thanatos drives self-destruction. And so to resolve this internal conflict, because Freud was big on resolving internal conflicts, people would take their Thanatos out on others, i.e. releasing their destructive tendencies on other people. One element of the dual instinct theory is the notion of catharsis. So the theory of catharsis proposed by Freud in 1920 states that we can release our destructive energy through non-aggressive behaviors like making jokes about ourselves or others, but that this can only suppress the death instinct for a certain amount of time before it isn't really enough. So in his final interview on the eve of his arranged death, Ted Bundy was killed in the electric chair. Bundy disclosed what he believes to have been the driving force behind everything that he did, which was pornography. According to this theory proposed by Freud, what had happened to Bundy was a relatively simple process. As stated earlier, Bundy had access to his grandfather's porn collection, so it wasn't hard for him to get a hold of, as according to Bundy in his final interview in 1983. His aggression was at first taken out by viewing this type of violent media, i.e. pornography. As Bundy got older, he would seek out more extreme kinds of pornography, bondage, etc., for example, until at some point it wasn't enough to calm his urge of the death instinct. Because of this, he had to move to something else that would have been stealing, but again, this would only temporarily last. So eventually Bundy would work his way up to kidnapping, rape, murder, and then even necrophilia. So according to this theory proposed by Freud, Bundy would need to keep increasing his aggressive tendencies to avoid taking them out on himself. And since porn was prevalent in his life at such a young age, this maybe catapulted the process exponentially in a way that caused him to be so destructive to so many people. There's little empirical evidence to support this theory, however. While this theory seems logical, there's little empirical evidence to make it seem even somewhat true, according to Cray. In the case of Bundy, it would make sense that this was a leading cause of how Ted Bundy came to be who he was. And as stated earlier, Bundy related closest to his grandfather, whom he thought was his father originally, who was abusive, temperamental, and had major pornographic interest. So if this is the person he related to the most, then it's very possible that he would end up similar, or in this case, even more extreme than his grandfather did. Here I included Ted Bundy's final interview. It runs about 30 minutes long, and it's a pretty interesting watch, I thought. Learning Theory by Bandura, and that's Bandura. So originally proposed by Albert Bandura in 1983, this theory has two elements of learning involved with it, instrumental learning and modeling, as cited in Cray. Instrumental learning is learning or behavioral change through direct reinforcement, positive or negative. To put it in terms of parenting, do as I say, not as I do. Modeling is learning or behavioral change through vicarious reinforcement. Simply put, do as you see, not as I say, which is generally not a typical parenting strategy, but is often used by parents without knowing it. For the analysis of Ted Bundy, modeling will be the main focus of his actions. As stated several times now, Bundy related most to his abusive, short-tempered, pornographically involved grandfather. There are no accounts of Bundy being the direct victim of his grandfather's abuse, but there is evidence that he witnessed it. It is possible that the environment that Bundy was raised in was hostile, being an illegitimate child in a deeply religious household with an abusive father figure until he was about 7. So this theory is also relatively straightforward. The famous study done by Bandura in the Bobo doll experiments in 1961 proved that when shown aggressive tendencies that are rewarded by society, then copying those behaviors will result in similar behavior by the observer. So it is also noted that the behavior is also more salient if done by somebody that is similar to the observer. So in this case, Bundy may have looked much like his grandfather, presumably so since they were related, was male like his grandfather, and grew up watching his grandfather abuse his grandmother and birth mother. So as is common with most abusive households, the wife and daughter most likely did not fight back. So when the grandfather was angered about something, he would likely solve it by abusing his wife and daughter, which would, for lack of a better term, put them in their place and stop the agitation to the grandfather. Ted most likely learned this attitude from his grandfather, saw it being positively reinforced by the sheer fact that it worked, and consequently grew up thinking that it was an appropriate way to deal with his problems. The evidence is not compelling, but it is possible. So there is no hard evidence to support the idea that Bundy's grandfather was abusive. This is only a very popular rumor. In addition to that, even if he was abusive, there's even less evidence on whom he abused. For all anybody knows, it was Ted directly, but again, there's no first-hand accounts of that. In addition to this, Ted grew up in a loving, peaceful household for a majority of his life after his mother moved them to Tacoma with Johnny Bundy. This was ample time for Bundy to change his behavior, but it may have been too late to change it since in the younger years the younger years are generally more influential on who people become. So while this theory makes a lot of sense, there are still some definite holes in the validity of it as it pertains to Ted Bundy. So, sorry, that was my email. And there's a picture of Ted Bundy as a kid and then at his trial. So the general aggression model proposed by Anderson and DeWall. The general aggression model, also known as GAM, was originally proposed by DeWall and Anderson in 2011, so it's a relatively new, sorry, that was my email again, relatively new theory of aggression. So the GAM is basically a synthesis of all the theories of aggression rolled into one that considers all the factors of aggression mentioned in Chapter 2 of the Cray textbook. So the GAM assumes that aggressive situations start with interaction between individual dispositions and the particular cues within a situation. So in basic terms, the GAM takes into account both an organism's biological factors and the situational cues that can trigger certain responses. Depending on how these situations are presented and what the organism is like, in this case as a person, will depend on how that organism reacts to a given situation. So to the left I put in a flowchart of how the general aggression model works. And then just to explain it, it starts bilaterally, taking both the person and the situation into account. These two things combined cause an internal reaction to be elicited. Part of this internal reaction is a subconscious evaluation of the situation at hand and how that person wants to react to it. Depending on both the person and the situation, the person will either react in an impulsive manner in which they do not think about their actions, or they will react rationally and not impulsively, where they'll think the situation through. Finally, this will lead to the resolution, however that may be, of the situation. So whatever they decide internally is what happens, basically. And as with most other theories of aggression, the more favorable a situation turns out for the aggressive actor, the more likely they are to perform that behavior again. So just the general aggression model continued, and this is the analysis of Ted Bundy. So in theory, in the case of Ted Bundy, this would be a prime explanation of why he was the way that he was. In reality, this is not the case, however. So biologically, Bundy knew next to nothing about his own father. He didn't know whether or not he was a sweetheart or an abuser or both. Eventually, Bundy knew the name of his father, where he went to college, that he was in the Air Force, and that he was a salesman, as cited in Rule in 1980. As for the situational aspect of the general aggression model, it's unknown when Ted Bundy took his first victim. According to this theory, however, whenever he took his first victim, it would have had to have gone in a specific way that Bundy would have later learned to replicate due to its effectiveness, and or improve upon, because he didn't get caught, so he would have either improved on it or just done the exact same thing. There's so much unknown about the life of Ted Bundy that this explanation has too many holes in it to say definitively whether or not this explains him. So due to his father being absent, his ambiguous past while growing up with his grandparents, and the unknown origin of his first kidnap, murder, rape, tear, this theory is too hard to assess whether or not Bundy can be explained by it. If there's more known about Bundy's father, this would be more helpful, or if there was more known about his first attack, those would be solid indicators of why Bundy ended up the way that he did, but those things are all missing, so it's nearly impossible to say definitively, so we can only speculate. One possible explanation, according to the general aggression model, however, is narcissism. So one thing that was rumored about Ted Bundy was that he was a very narcissistic individual. Evidence of this is not ample, but it is existent. For example, police say that at some point Bundy started doing less and less to cover up who he was and what he was doing just because he thought he could get away with it, and that was cited in Rule in 1980. In addition to this, Bundy represented himself in court while waving at cameras and flirting with women. Women reportedly would swoon over him because of he was so attractive and dreamy, even though they knew exactly what it was that he did, and he ate all this up as if he were some sort of celebrity. Um, and then, as stated later in the textbook, Huseman identified 3 characteristics to be associated with terrorism, which by definition was what Ted Bundy was. So one of those characteristics is narcissism, which can be defined as a grandiose view of the self and a sense of entitlement that leads to aggression when challenged by others. In 2010b, as cited by Cray in 2013. So according to this definition and his public appearances of narcissistic tendencies, it could have been that Bundy, who generally chose women reflecting the first woman he had ever loved, who was Stephanie Brooks, was also the first to reject him and leave him, even though he loved her. He chose to attack these women as a way of getting back at Stephanie, since Stephanie challenged his complete autonomy over her, like in any case with his abusive grandfather. So he took his anger out on them. And I'm sorry about my email yet again. So to the left is a collage of the known Ted Bundy victims. He confirmed over 30. It's suspected that there was up to 50 or more. So the final analysis of Ted Bundy. The best explanation for the analysis of Ted Bundy is the psychoanalysis by Freud. While there is the least amount of empirical evidence to support the theory itself, it is the best fit for Bundy due to the fact that it only takes into account his known actions. There is no speculation about whether or not this one fits Bundy, only whether or not it is a viable theory at all. Because of this, it seems like maybe this is a good fit because there are so few restrictions imposed upon it, but it's still the best. This is the best for understanding Bundy because it puts him under a lens that rationally explains his actions. However ancient this theory may seem, it gives the most room for explanation when it comes to Bundy's actions. So basically, there's the most wiggle room, but it's also the best explanation just because it doesn't involve his questionable past. It's all just definitively based on what we know that he did. The worst explanation for analysis of Ted Bundy is the learning theory. So the worst explanation would be learning theory. While this may logically seem like it would fit the best, there are too many question marks regarding the upbringing of Bundy to make any definitive statements. Bundy explained that he grew up in a loving religious household in his final interview, and this doesn't sound like he learned aggression at home. There's too much speculation and too many holes in the story of his childhood to make this theory worth applying to analyze Ted Bundy. So basically, this one would rely a lot on how he was raised, and there's a lot of questions on how he was actually raised. So it's not the best example to use to analyze him. And an intervention suggestion that I thought of was prison reformation or aggression outlets. So the things that Bundy did were undoubtedly aggressive, but there may have been ways to save him. So Bundy did escape incarceration at one point in his life, but while he was in prison, he was not a violent person. It was as if being around women triggered him for some reason. It may have been Stephanie breaking his heart, or the distrust of his mother after he found out that she wasn't his sister. Anyway, prison is a natural choice for reforming Bundy. If he was still alive, removing the aggressive cue, in this case women, he may eventually achieve remission from his aggressive temptations. Another solution could be aggressive outlets. Basically, these are just coping mechanisms to deal with overly aggressive people. Some people work out, others go to shooting ranges, other people paint or box or whatever it is, just to sort of take their mind off of their aggressive cues and channel it into something else. There are many outlets to release aggression, and maybe if Bundy had these available to him or interested him at all, if there was another way he could have channeled his aggression, the world may have been a very different place, not only for Bundy, but for a lot of women and their families. And these are my references. Thanks for watching.